The Information Regulator has published new rules of the Protection of Personal Information Act that local business will have to abide by, rather. The purpose is to outline how all the conditions for the lawful processing of personal information should be applied by providing minimum criteria to develop a code. In essence, this means that much less spam and robocalls, as companies will now need your permission to contact you. Failure of complying with the rules will mean jail time and fines for the business owners. To help us make better sense on what this means for consumers, I'm joined by the chairperson of SA Information Regulator, Advocate Pansy Tlakula. Advocate, a very good evening. Please take us through what this means for the average South African citizen.
Good evening, Hugo. The first thing that we have to say is that I read newspaper articles and even yourself, you said businesses will have to comply. I think I have to correct that. The Protection of Personal Information Act applies to private and public bodies, which means that even a government department, state-owned enterprises, everyone will have to comply as long as you process personal information. And process, just to bring everybody on board, the definition of process is anyone who collects information, who collates that information, who stores that information. All that is defined as processing. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule. People who process personal information for household activities, you don't have to comply with the law. And also those who process personal information purely for journalistic purposes like yourselves, you don't have to comply with the law, provided, of course, that your media house has subscribed to a code of ethics that contains adequate safeguards for the protection of personal information. Other than those exceptions, then of course, if you look at the Act, there are many other exceptions. So everyone, public bodies and private bodies that are not exempted from the provisions of the Act will have to comply with the Act from the 1st of July 2021. And as you have correctly pointed out, the Act lays down 8 conditions which everyone who processes personal information has to comply with. I can give you a few examples. For instance, if you process personal information, you have to collect it from me directly, and you have to collect it with my consent. And you have to use my personal information only for the purpose for which you collected it. Should you want to share that information with anybody else, you have to get my consent. Those are the conditions that you have spoken about. I can elaborate more, but let me hear what else you want me to say.
So we can expect a reduction in the number of calls that come through to our mobile phones regarding prospective products that half the time we're not interested in.
Well, the jury's still out on that because, what the Act prohibits is unsolicited electronic communication. So you cannot send unsolicited electronic communication. Why I'm saying some people, and we're still going to look into this, says that spam through phones, if you call me to market goods to me through voice, that does not constitute electronic communication. But a recorded message, because you must know that some of these companies send as recorded messages. So there is a legal interpretation that I have heard that says, if I get a recorded message, that will be prohibited in terms of the Act. But on the other hand, if a call center calls me, that is allowed in terms of the Act. But I don't want to, at this point in time, to give a definitive answer whether calls from call center do not constitute unsolicited electronic communication, because we are still going to look into that.
So things like SMSs would be covered under unsolicited. Now,
SMS, certainly SMSs will be prohibited. If you get an SMS, some people, you'll have an opt-out, or even when people call you, if you tell them that please don't call me again, they shouldn't call you. And if you get an SMS, if you then tell them you opt out or you say stop, they shouldn't send you an SMS again. And that's if they continue.
Advocate, if I could just come in there. So are we saying that come July, those that have my details can still send me an SMS, and I then have the privilege of declining further SMSs, or are they expected to stop sending me SMSs immediately without first checking with me if I'd like to receive those SMSs?
You see, what they can send you, but once you tell them to stop sending you SMSs, then they shouldn't send you anymore. And should they send you, they continue to send you SMSs, please contact us and we'll deal with that.
I'm sure lots of people will be contacting you. Now, companies are expected to adhere by July. What is the expectation?
Hugo, private and public bodies, government, departments, and companies. We should make that very clear. This act does not only apply to companies.
Okay, so you've said organizations, government, private businesses, all those that are collecting information should adhere by July. What is this adherence process?
It's compliance. You have to have a privacy policy in place, which says how you're going to store personal information, how you're going to protect it, for how long are you going to keep it in your system. I mean, let me give you an example. Companies employ people, they advertise for jobs, and then people send their CVs, which contain a lot of personal information. Some people will be called for interviews, others not. And that personal information will have been collected by the company with the consent of the owner of the personal information. But after using the personal information for the purpose for which it was collected, which was for job interviews or for job applications, those CVs have to be destroyed, for instance. So all companies have to have policies. Like I said, media, for instance, if you collect for journalistic purposes, you are excluded from the act. However, if we look at newsroom, I don't know who owns newsroom as a company, collects personal information of its employees, it collects personal information of its service providers and so on. As a company, as an entity, newsroom will have to comply. But the personal information that you collect for this purpose, for instance, for interviewing me, you have my recording, which is still personal information. Because you are collecting it for journalistic purposes, then newsroom will then be exempted from the act. So it means that all private and public bodies should have compliance processes and mechanisms in place in terms of all these things that I've mentioned. They collect personal information. How are they going to store that personal information? How are they going to ensure the security of that personal information, to ensure that it's not accessed unlawfully or by people who do not have authority to access it? Because we know that in our country now, there's a lot of cyber criminality. Companies are hacked, personal information of people is obtained unlawfully. So private and public bodies that collect personal information, they have to ensure that they put adequate security measures in place, which have to be technical and organizational, to protect the security of that information, which means that even employees, when we talk about organizational measures to protect the security of the information, it means employees have to be trained right from the people at reception. In most organizations, when you enter a building, there is a man who's sitting, normally it's a man, sometimes it's a woman, who take at security desk. They take our personal information. They will take my name, they'll take my cell phone number. At times they even require your ID. I don't know why ID is required. And they have these pieces of paper that are lying all over the place with our personal information. From the 1st of July, failure to protect that personal information will attract sanctions, which means that even those books where our personal information is recorded at the security desks of buildings, that information must be kept securely, which means that maybe there has to be a safe where that personal information is properly kept. So everyone then has to put those processes in place.
Advocate Tlhakula, thank you kindly for your time this evening. That was Chairperson of SA Information Regulator, Advocate Panti Tlhakula.